He suspected his maid was stealing from him. For 3 weeks, he watched her sneak out of his luxury Boston penthouse long after dark, carrying 2 heavy, faded canvas tote bags. Bags she certainly hadn't brought in with her that morning. So one rainy Thursday night, he decided to follow her, ready to catch her in the act. What he discovered down in the shadows of the city left him completely speechless. Harrison Vance was 38 years old and owned half of Boston. He was a rising titan of venture capital and commercial real estate, a man who noticed every number, every margin, every tiny inconsistency on a financial spreadsheet. Except, of course, for the woman who had practically raised him. Her name was Eleanor Ross. She was 60 years old, dressed in simple, worn clothes, and she had been with the Vance family since Harrison was 5 years old. When Harrison's mother died of sudden heart failure 33 years ago, it was Eleanor who stood by his small bed through the terror of his midnight panic attacks. When his father dissolved into a haze of grief and scotch, it was Eleanor who kept the estate running, ironed Harrison's school uniforms, and made sure the house never felt entirely dead. She had loved him when no one else in his world was capable of loving anything. But as Harrison grew older, wealthier, and colder, Eleanor became invisible. She was just there, quiet, faithful, seamlessly wiping down granite counters and serving coffee at 6 a.m. sharp. Harrison never asked about her personal life. He never wondered where she went when her shift ended at night. To him, she was a fixture of his luxury, as permanent and unexamined as the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of his Harborview penthouse. Until 3 weeks ago. It started on a Tuesday evening. Harrison was working late in his private study when he heard the soft click of the heavy front door. He looked out the frosted glass panel to see Eleanor slipping down the corridor, her coat pulled tight against her shoulders, holding 2 heavy, bulging canvas tote bags. He didn't think much of it at first, but then it happened again on Thursday, and again the following Monday. Same dark hour, same heavy bags weighing down her frail shoulders, same hasty exit into the night. Harrison's analytical, corporate mind immediately went to the dark place. She's taking something. He ran a silent inventory check of the penthouse over the next 2 days. His safe, his art collection, his expensive silver, his wine cellar. Nothing was missing, but those heavy canvas bags kept appearing every few nights, and a sharp, paranoid question began to burn in his chest. What is she hiding from me? So on a bitterly cold, rain-swept Thursday night, Harrison decided to get his answer. He left his office early, parked his dark sports sedan down the block from his residence, and waited in the shadows. At 8:15 p.m., Eleanor stepped out of the private service entrance. Her head was bowed against the driving rain, her worn coat wrapped tightly around her frame, her hands gripped tightly around the handles of those 2 heavy bags. Harrison started his engine, flicked his headlights off, and slowly pulled out to follow her. Eleanor didn't take a taxi, nor did she head toward the quiet suburban train station. She walked 3 blocks through the freezing rain and boarded an outbound city bus heading south, deep into the rough, crumbling pockets of South Boston. Harrison trailed the bus from a distance. As he drove, his eyes scanned the street corners through his rain-slicked windshield. He recognized these blocks. His real estate firm, Vance Development, owned over 40% of the land in this district. These were the exact neighborhoods his corporate board had targeted for sweeping commercial redevelopment. Blocks of old brownstones and local businesses that his company was systematically buying up, demolishing, and pricing original working-class families out of to construct luxury high-rises. The bus pulled up near 64th Street. Eleanor stepped off into the rain, clutching her bags, and turned down a dark, narrow alley behind an old, stone church with peeling paint and boarded-up stained-glass windows. Harrison parked his car by a broken hydrant, pulled his coat collar up, and stepped out into the biting wind. His leather shoes splashed through cold puddles as he quietly followed her down the alleyway. Eleanor stopped at a heavy green iron door marked St. Jude's Mission. She knocked 3 times in a quick rhythm. The door cracked open, warm yellow light spilled out into the dark alley, and she stepped inside. Harrison waited 5 seconds, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. He approached the door, pulled the iron handle, and slipped into the dim hallway. He followed the echo of voices down a flight of worn concrete stairs into the basement. He paused near the bottom step, hiding behind an exposed brick pillar, expecting to see a fencing operation, stolen goods, or something nefarious. Instead, the scene before him stopped the breath in his lungs. The vast church basement was packed with people, homeless men in worn coats, young mothers with shivering children wrapped in thin blankets, elderly residents with tired, hollow eyes. They were sitting at long, folding wooden tables, eating hot soup and fresh bread from paper plates. And right in the center of it all, standing over a massive stainless steel soup pot at the back stove, was Eleanor Ross. Her hair was down from its usual tight bun, falling over a faded wool sweater. She was laughing, a bright, warm, joyous laugh Harrison hadn't heard in 20 years. She was serving piping hot beef stew in a bowls, calling every single person in that basement by their first name, touching their shoulders, and listening intently to their stories. A young veteran in a faded military jacket stepped up to the counter. "Miss Eleanor, did you bring any of that cornbread tonight?" "Made 2 pans fresh this afternoon, Marcus," Eleanor said with a radiant smile, reaching into one of those heavy canvas tote bags and handing him 2 large pieces wrapped neatly in foil. "Eat up. You need your strength." A tiny 5-year-old girl pulled on Eleanor's apron string. "Where does the warm food come from, Miss Eleanor?" Eleanor knelt down on the hard concrete floor, taking the child's small, cold hands in her own. "I make it with love, baby, so you can grow up big and strong." Harrison backed against the brick pillar, unable to catch his breath. His chest felt tight, constricted by a wave of crushing, unbearable shame. Those canvas bags weren't filled with stolen silver from his penthouse. They were filled with groceries she had bought with her own modest paycheck. Eleanor was using her small income and her few free hours to feed the very people his real estate company had pushed onto the streets. She could have asked Harrison for financial help. She could have asked him for a donation, a grant, or a venue. But as Harrison stood in the dark corners of that basement, watching her offer gentle grace to a room full of forgotten souls, a devastating truth hit him. After 33 years of raising him, Eleanor had quietly decided something fundamental about Harrison Vance. She didn't trust him with her mercy. Before we continue with this powerful journey, please take a moment to subscribe to Profound Tales, like this video, and drop a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from today. Stories like this remind us that the greatest heroes among us rarely wear crowns. They usually wear aprons. Harrison stumbled back up the concrete stairs into the freezing rain, his mind reeling. The cold drops hit his face, but he didn't feel them. He walked back to his car, sat in the dark driver's seat with the engine off, and stared at the green iron door of St. Jude's Mission. He waited for 2 full hours. At 10:30 p.m., the heavy door finally creaked open. Eleanor stepped out alone into the alley. Her canvas tote bags were empty now, swinging loosely at her sides. Her steps were slow, heavy, and visibly exhausted. Harrison started his car, pulled out of the shadows, and stopped right beside her on the curb. He rolled down the passenger side window. "Eleanor," he called out softly. She turned sharply, startled. For a fraction of a second, confusion flashed across her face, followed by a quiet, heartbreaking sadness when she recognized his car. She didn't look angry. She just looked tired. "Get in, please," Harrison said, his voice raw. She didn't argue. She opened the door, set her empty canvas bags on the floorboard, and sat down in the leather passenger seat. Harrison pulled into the street. For 10 long blocks, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the steady rhythm of the windshield wipers sweeping rain off the glass. "How long?" Harrison asked finally, his voice cracking slightly in the dark cabin. "How long have you been going down there?" Eleanor stared out the passenger window at the glowing neon lights of the city. 17 years, she said quietly. "Since my daughter, Clara, died." Harrison's hands froze on the steering wheel. He remembered the funeral 17 years ago. He remembered sending a massive, expensive floral arrangement from his corporate office to the church, but he had been too busy with an international merger to attend the service himself. He had never asked Eleanor how her daughter died. He had never asked how she was coping with the grief. "Why didn't you ever tell me, Eleanor?" Harrison asked, leaning over the wheel, his jaw tight with suppressed emotion. "You could have asked me for funding. My foundation gives away millions every year." Eleanor turned her head slowly to look at him. Her hazel eyes were calm, soft, but cut through his corporate shield like a razor. "And what would you have done, Harrison?" she asked softly. Her voice wasn't filled with hatred. It was filled with something far worse, pity. "You would have turned those people into a tax write-off. You would have brought news cameras down into that basement, put your corporate logo on the soup kitchen, and made their pain about your public image. I wanted them to stay human, Harrison. I didn't want them to become your charity case." Something broke inside Harrison's chest. The words landed with the weight of sledgehammer. He couldn't speak for the rest of the drive. He didn't drive back to his luxury penthouse. He followed her instructions, navigating deep into South Boston until he pulled up to a small, modest two-story home. "Let me walk you to the door," Harrison said quietly, stepping out into the rain before she could protest. He took her empty canvas bags and walked her up the narrow wooden steps of her porch. Eleanor unlocked the front door and pushed it open, stepping into her small, warm living room. Harrison stood on the threshold, looking inside. The home was humble, filled with old furniture, knitted blankets, and framed photographs of her late daughter. But as Harrison's eyes scanned the hallway wall, he froze. Hanging inside a shadow box frame, near the doorway was a dark blue military ribbon and a gleaming medal, the Silver Star. Beneath the medal was an official certificate from the United States Department of Defense, reading, "For conspicuous gallantry in action against an armed enemy." Awarded to Nurse Sergeant Eleanor Ross for courageous service and saving 18 lives under heavy enemy fire during combat deployment. Harrison stood in absolute, stunned silence. The woman who scrubbed his toilets, ironed his shirts, and made his espresso every morning at 6 a.m. was a decorated military combat hero who had bled for her country and saved 18 human lives under gunfire. And in 33 years, Harrison Vance had never asked her a single question about who she was. Harrison didn't sleep that night. He sat in his dark penthouse study until the sun began to rise over Boston Harbor. The luxury around him, the glass walls, the imported Italian furniture, the multi-million-dollar art pieces, felt suffocating, hollow, and completely absurd. He pulled out his laptop and typed her name into official database registries. Eleanor M. Ross. A few sparse military records appeared, confirming her service as an Army nurse sergeant in combat zones, alongside her Silver Star commendation. But there were no news articles, no high-profile profile pieces, no public recognition. The world had forgotten her service, and Harrison had spent 3 decades treating her like background furniture in his own life. At 7 a.m., the front door clicked. Eleanor walked into the penthouse, dressed in her usual dark blue housekeeping uniform. Her face was pale, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. But she immediately walked to the kitchen and began setting out his coffee cup and cutting fresh fruit into perfect slices. Harrison walked into the kitchen, his heart aching. "Eleanor, stop," he said softly. She paused, holding a kitchen knife over an orange. "Good morning, Mr. Vance." Mr. Vance. The formal title hit him like a physical blow. After 33 years of holding him through nightmares as a child, she still used corporate formality because he had built an impenetrable wall of class divide between them. "Eleanor, you don't need to do that," Harrison said, stepping closer. "Sit down, please." "I have work to do, sir," she said quietly, keeping her eyes fixed on the cutting board. "I called my head of human resources an hour ago," Harrison said, his voice trembling slightly. "I had your health insurance upgraded to our top executive tier. Unlimited coverage, full private specialist access, 0 copays." Eleanor set the knife down slowly. She turned to face him, her expression hardening not with gratitude, but with a sharp, weary disappointment. "Why now?" "Harrison," she asked softly. "Because I didn't know." "You didn't ask," Eleanor interrupted, her voice trembling with 33 years of suppressed truth. "I have worked in this house since you were 5 years old. You never wondered if I was lonely, if I was hurting, or if I could afford my own life. And now you come to me with corporate insurance upgrades because you feel guilty about what you saw in that basement? She took a step toward him, her hazel eyes unflinching. I held you when your mother died. Harrison, she whispered, tears finally pooling in her tired eyes. I sat with you in the dark when you were terrified. I loved you like my own child, and you don't even know my middle name. The silence that followed was suffocating. Harrison opened his mouth to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, but the words caught in his throat because he knew she was right about every single detail. I don't need you to fix your guilt through me, Harrison, Eleanor said, picking up her cleaning basket. If you want to change, look at what your company is doing to the people in this city. She walked out of the kitchen, down the long corridor. Over the next 3 days, Harrison tried to focus on his work, but his corporate world was crumbling around him. He sat in executive meetings, staring at development reports, seeing not profit margins, but the faces of the people eating soup in that church basement. He began working from his home study just to watch Eleanor. And for the first time in his life, he saw what he had been blind to for years. The way she gripped the kitchen counter when she thought he wasn't looking, the subtle limp in her right leg, the way she paused at the top of the marble stairs to catch her raspy breath. She was in physical pain, and she had been hiding it from him for years. On Wednesday morning, Harrison's phone rang sharply. It was Dr. Patel from Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Mr. Vance? You are listed as the primary emergency contact for Eleanor Ross. Harrison stood up so fast his desk chair overturned. What happened? Is she okay? She collapsed during a routine checkup at our outpatient clinic, the doctor said gravely. We have admitted her to the emergency cardiac unit. Harrison tore out of his penthouse, driving like a madman through the Boston traffic until he reached the hospital. He sprinted through the glass doors, pushing past orderlies until he found her private room on the 4th floor. Eleanor lay in the hospital bed, hooked up to 4 lines and heart monitors. She looked tiny, fragile, and utterly exhausted. Dr. Patel stepped outside into the hallway with Harrison. She is stable for now, Mr. Vance, but her body is severely depleted. She has advanced, unmanaged type 2 diabetes, severe anemia, and early-stage kidney stress. Harrison pressed his hand against his face. How could this happen? Why wasn't she receiving treatment? Because up until your insurance changed yesterday, her basic coverage didn't cover specialist care or continuous monitoring, Dr. Patel said quietly, looking at him with gentle honesty. She told me she's been skipping her own prescription medications for almost 4 years because she couldn't afford them on her wage after buying food for her community shelter. Harrison closed his eyes, leaning his head against the cold hospital wall as tears burned down his cheeks. She had been sacrificing her own body, her own health, and her own life to feed strangers, while living in the home of the man who owned half of Boston. Harrison walked back into the room, pulling a chair right beside her bed. He sat down, took Eleanor's thin, worn hand in his own, and buried his face in her palm, weeping silently. Eleanor stirred, her eyes opening slowly. She looked down at the billionaire sitting on the floor beside her bed, sobbing like the scared 5-year-old boy she had held 33 years ago. Harrison, she whispered weakly. Her middle name is Marie. Harrison choked out through his tears, looking up at her with raw, unvarnished grief. Eleanor Marie Ross, born in 1964. You saved 18 lives in the military, you lost your daughter Clara to diabetes because you couldn't afford insulin back then, and you spent 17 years feeding strangers because no one else would. Eleanor's eyes filled with soft tears. I'm so sorry, Eleanor, Harrison begged, squeezing her hand. I am so sorry for being blind. I can't undo 33 years of neglect, but I swear to you, on my mother's memory, I'm going to change. I'm going to do better. Eleanor looked at him for a long, quiet moment. Then, her frail fingers slowly reached out and touched his cheek. Then start with the people outside your window. Harrison, she whispered gently, stop building monuments to yourself and start giving people a place to belong. Harrison spent the next 2 days in the quiet corridors of Northwestern Memorial Hospital. He worked from a laptop on the small visitor's couch in Eleanor's room. making sure her medical team had every resource available. But when Thursday evening arrived, he closed his laptop, put on a dark coat, and drove south to St. Jude's Mission alone. The autumn air was crisp as he walked down the worn concrete steps into the church basement. The smell of hot soup lingered in the room, but the atmosphere was anxious. A young veteran in a faded military jacket stood near the stacked folding chairs, looking toward the kitchen door. It was Marcus, the man Harrison had watched Eleanor serve weeks prior. Marcus looked up as Harrison approached, recognition immediately flashing in his eyes. He crossed his arms, his posture stiffening into a defensive guard. "You're the developer," Marcus said, his voice flat. "Vance Development. I saw your picture on the redevelopment notices they posted on the block." "I am," Harrison admitted quietly, stopping a few feet away. "I came to tell you that Eleanor won't be here tonight. She's in the hospital." A sudden wave of concern broke through Marcus's tough exterior. "Is Miss Eleanor okay?" "She collapsed from exhaustion and unmanaged health issues," Harrison explained, his voice raw. "She's stable now, but she needs rest. I came down here to serve the soup tonight in her place." Marcus let out a bitter, cynical laugh, shaking his head. "You? Serve soup to the people your company is pushing onto the street? Man, that's rich." "I know how it looks," Harrison said, looking Marcus in the eye. "And I know I don't deserve your trust. But Eleanor spent 17 years coming down here because she cared about this room. If the food doesn't get served tonight, people go hungry. Just tell me what needs to be done." Marcus stared at him for a long, tense moment, assessing the billionaire standing in front of him in an expensive coat. Finally, Marcus gestured toward the kitchen counter. "The soup needs stirring. Pots are on a back stove." For the next 3 hours, Harrison Vance, a man who managed billions in assets, stood over a stainless steel stove in a church basement, stirring soup, ladling hot broth into paper bowls, and handing out bread. It was awkward at first. He struggled to look people in the eye, crushed by the weight of what his corporate decisions had cost them. Halfway through the evening, an elderly man leaning heavily on a wooden cane walked through the line. He had a sharp, intelligent face, but his clothes were worn and his eyes carried a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. "Evening," the man said softly, taking a bowl from Harrison's hands. "Good evening," Harrison replied. He hesitated, looking at the man's name tag pinned to his jacket. "Mr. Darius?" The man paused, looking up. "Darius Vance. No relation to your company, I assure you." Harrison felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He pulled out a mental record from his recent development filings. Darius Vance, 114th Street, the brownstone apartments near the harbor. Darius's eyes narrowed slightly, but his voice remained steady and calm. "That's right. Lived in Unit 3B for 42 years. Raised 3 children there. Buried my wife from that front porch. Then your firm bought the deed 2 years ago, raised the monthly rate by 300%, and gave us 45 days to clear out." Harrison couldn't breathe. "The buyout option. $8,000, Darius said, a quiet, cutting edge entering his voice. $8,000 for 42 years of my life. It barely covered 4 months of rent anywhere else in this city. Now I sleep in the shelter down the block or on a folding chair in this basement when they have room." Darius set his spoon down, looking directly into Harrison's eyes. "The worst part isn't even losing the brick and mortar, Mr. Vance," Darius whispered. "The worst part is knowing that to you and your board, my entire life was just a line item on a spreadsheet that needed to be erased for a higher profit margin." The words cut clean through Harrison's chest. He opened his mouth to apologize, but Darius simply picked up his tray and walked slowly toward a corner table. Harrison stood alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the murmur of quiet conversations, feeling smaller than he ever had in his entire life. The next morning at 8 a.m., Harrison walked into the executive boardroom on the 50th floor of the Vance Development Tower. 8 board members and senior partners sat around the massive glass table, sipping espresso, reviewing Q4 revenue projections. Sitting at the far end was his CFO, Richard Sterling, a man who valued metrics above humanity. Harrison didn't sit down. He remained standing at the head of the table, setting a thick black binder on the glass surface. "I'm calling an immediate freeze on the Harborview South redevelopment project," Harrison announced, his voice steady, ringing clearly across the room. The boardroom went dead silent. Richard Sterling blinked in disbelief, setting his coffee cup down. "Harrison, what are you talking about? Harborview South is a $200 million acquisition. We break ground in 6 weeks. We are halting the eviction notices," Harrison continued, unbothered by the sudden tension in the room. "And we are completely restructuring our development model. Moving forward, Vance Development will mandate a minimum 40% allocation for affordable and community-owned housing on every residential property we acquire." A chorus of sharp, angry protests erupted across the table. "Are you insane?" Richard demanded, standing up. 40%? That cuts our projected investor yields by nearly 45%. The board will never approve that, and our equity partners will pull out by noon. "Then let them pull out," Harrison said, leaning over the table, his eyes burning with an unyielding intensity. "For 10 years, we have called this urban revitalization. But it isn't revitalization, it's extraction. We buy up neighborhoods from working-class people who built them, displace veterans like Darius Vance who live there for 40 years, and build luxury towers for people who don't even live in the city 6 months out of the year. This is business, Harrison," Richard shouted. "We run a real estate firm, not a charity. We run a business made of human beings." Harrison slammed his hand against the binder on the table. "Inside this book are the names of 2,000 families we have displaced over the last decade. Real people, real lives. And I am done building monuments to my own greed on top of the people who make this city work. If you push this vote, Harrison," Richard warned, his voice dropping into a dangerous register, "we will move to vote you out as managing partner." Harrison looked around the table at his board. 2 members looked away in shame, but 3 others sat up straight, watching him with quiet respect. "Vote however you want, Richard," Harrison said quietly, picking up his coat. "But as long as my name is on the front door, this company is going to start building places where people actually belong." 4 days later, Eleanor Ross was discharged from Northwestern Memorial Hospital. When her private car pulled up to her modest home in South Boston, she found Harrison waiting on the porch steps. But he wasn't wearing his tailored executive suit. He wore dark jeans, a simple coat, and held a thick leather portfolio under his arm. "Welcome home, Eleanor," Harrison said, offering a warm, genuine smile as he walked down the steps to assist her. Eleanor looked at him carefully, noticing the deep shift in his posture. The tension in his shoulders was gone, replaced by a quiet, grounded calm. "Thank you, Harrison. But what are you doing here?" "I have something to show you," he said, opening the front door for her and guiding her to the kitchen table. He unrolled a set of large architectural blueprints across the table. Printed across the top header in bold, clean lettering were the words, "Haboa Commons Community Equity Initiative." Eleanor leaned over the plans, her eyes scanning the site maps. This is the South Boston Waterfront Project." "It was," Harrison corrected gently. "Now it's Harbor Commons. 40% of the residential units are locked in as permanent, affordable housing. The ground floor includes a permanent community center, a veteran outreach hub, and a nonprofit kitchen facility." Eleanor looked up at him, her hazel eyes searching his face in wonder. "Harrison, how did you pass this through your board?" "It wasn't easy," Harrison smiled softly. "Richard Sterling resigned, and 2 investors pulled out. But the rest of the board stayed. We recalculated our margins, extended our project timelines, and decided that doing things right was worth more than fast profit." Harrison pulled an official corporate document from his portfolio and laid it directly in front of her. "I'm here to offer you a position, Eleanor," Harrison said, his voice thick with deep respect. "Director of Community Relations and Social Impact for Vance Development. Full executive salary, full medical benefits, and an absolute veto vote on every acquisition project this company undertakes." Eleanor stared at the document, her lips parting in shock. "Harrison, I'm a housekeeper. I clean floors. You are a decorated combat medic who saved 18 lives under fire, Harrison said firmly, tears welling in his eyes. You spent 17 years keeping this community alive while I was blind. I don't need a housekeeper, Eleanor. I need a partner who knows what grace looks like to teach me how to build things that actually matter. Eleanor looked down at the document, a quiet, beautiful tear spilling over her lashes, splashing onto the blue ink of the contract. 3 months later, Harrison stood before the Boston City Council in a packed municipal auditorium. Sitting in the front row of the gallery was Eleanor, wearing an elegant dark suit, sitting side by side with Darius Vance and Marcus. Harrison clicked to the main presentation slide on a large projector screen. Instead of corporate financial returns or luxury amenities, the screen displayed a photo of Darius Vance. "This is Darius Vance," Harrison announced into the microphone, his voice echoing through the council chamber. "He served his country, lived in South Boston for 42 years, and was displaced by my company 2 years ago. Under the new Harbor Commons proposal, Mr. Vance is not returning as a tenant. He has been appointed Senior Director of Resident Equity, ensuring every displaced family from the original block receives first right of return as partial equity owners in a new development." The council chamber erupted into quiet gasps and hushed whispers. "We are establishing a local hiring mandate," Harrison continued, gesturing toward Marcus in the front row, "partnering with local veteran organizations to provide high-wage construction and management jobs. This project will take longer to build, and our profit margins will be lower, but we will be building a community that lasts." The city council president looked at Harrison over her glasses, a look of profound astonishment on her face. "Mr. Vance, in 15 years on this council, I have never heard a real estate developer present a plan like this. What brought about this change?" Harrison turned his head slowly, looking down at Eleanor, sitting in the front row, the gold silver star locket catching the light against her coat. "I was blind for a long time," Harrison said softly into the microphone. "And then someone showed me that true success isn't about how high you build. It's about who you lift up along the way." The city council vote was unanimous. 18 months later, the morning sun broke over the South Boston waterfront, casting a brilliant golden light across the completed courtyards of Harbor Commons. The grand opening was not a cold corporate ribbon cutting with champagne and photographers. It was a massive, joyful neighborhood block party. Long wooden tables stretched across the central plaza, covered in fresh food, pastries, and hot coffee. Children ran through the fountain court. Music played from speakers near the community hall, and residents were carrying boxes into their brand-new, light-filled apartments. Darius Vance stood on the front balcony of his new second-floor apartment, a corner unit with large windows overlooking the harbor, flooding his living room with the morning sun. He looked down at Harrison, holding a coffee cup, and offered a warm, quiet nod of absolute respect and reconciliation. Marcus was near the community center doors, surrounded by a group of young veterans, explaining the new job training schedules with a bright, confident smile on his face. Harrison stood at the edge of the courtyard, wearing a simple linen shirt and trousers. He was talking with a young mother who had just received the keys to her new apartment, helping her carry a crib frame up the short flight of stone steps. Eleanor Ross walked over, standing beside Harrison as he set the crib down. Her hair was styled neatly, her health fully restored, and the gold-silver star locket rested proudly against her dress. "You look like you're actually enjoying yourself, Mr. Vance," Eleanor teased softly, a warm twinkle in her hazel eyes. Harrison laughed, a deep, genuine laugh that echoed across the brick courtyard. "I think I finally understand what life is actually for, Eleanor." He looked out over the crowded plaza, at the families who had returned home, at the veterans who had found purpose, at the children playing in the sunlit garden. "I spent 38 years building towers so I could look down on the world from the 72nd floor," Harrison whispered, his voice catching with emotion. "I thought I was powerful, but I was totally alone." Eleanor reached out, taking his hand in hers, her thin fingers squeezing his palm with the same gentle, fierce strength she had offered him 33 years ago when he was a grieving boy in a quiet house. "You aren't alone anymore, Harrison," Eleanor said softly. Harrison looked at her, tears of deep, overwhelming peace filling his eyes. Thank you, Eleanor, for not giving up on me when I was blind. Eleanor smiled, looking up at the bright blue sky over Boston Harbor, then back at the man she had raised. Welcome home, Harrison, she whispered. And as the sun reached its peak over Harbor Commons, filling every brick, every window, and every heart with warm light, Harrison Vance finally understood the truth. Home isn't a luxury penthouse you own. It's a place where you belong, where people know your name, and where love bends low enough to heal every broken place.